The Law and the Word, by Thomas Troward. Chapter 1. Certain phenomena in nature. Were one to inquire what distinguishes contemporary thought from that of preceding generations, I would posit that it is the burgeoning realization that thought constitutes a force in its own right, one of the primary energies of the universe, and ultimately the supreme power that directs all others. This concept propagates rapidly and widely across diverse nations and social strata. Nevertheless, it remains largely intangible, persisting in a vague and embryonic state, and has yet to yield the pragmatic individual or collective results that might reasonably be anticipated were it rendered more concrete. We resemble novices attempting to execute masterworks prior to comprehending the fundamental principles of art. Consequently, when we observe a proficient artist achieve with effortless grace that which we struggle to accomplish, we ascribe their success to some extraordinary dispensation rather than to our own deficiency in understanding. Thought is indeed the preeminent power of the universe. Yet, to employ it practically, we must comprehend the principles by which it is governed, recognizing that it is not an indeterminate influence drifting aimlessly, but one that operates under immutable laws as precise as those of mathematics, while simultaneously conferring unbounded liberty upon the individual. The objective of this treatise is to guide the reader from nebulous conceptions toward a more substantive and reliable foundation. I do not presume to unravel the inscrutable, for we can never transcend its boundaries. Yet, if I can demonstrate the appropriate methodology, analogous to employing a screwdriver rather than a hatchet, it may assist in disclosing truths that would otherwise remain concealed. We are all disciples, and the profound optimism of existence resides in the infinite prospects set before us, such that, regardless of how far we may advance, we perpetually stand upon the threshold of something grander. We ought to retain a youthful curiosity, remaining ever receptive and spiritually incomplete. Thus, the reader should regard these pages as a discourse among fellow students within the great school, tempering their expectations accordingly. The primary inquiry concerns our point of departure. Descartes commenced with "I think, therefore I am," and we can scarcely do better than to follow his precedent. We cannot call into question our own existence or the reality of the external world. Yet what entity within us perceives these phenomena and conceives our hopes, fears, and designs? It is not the physical corpus, for cognition persists independently of corporeal limitations. There exists within us an entity that receives impressions, reasons, decides, and acts, an entity entirely distinct from the physical body. This is the authentic self, the individual personality we are destined to cultivate, and a comprehension of the role of thought in this developmental process is of paramount importance. The forces of nature, such as steam, electricity, gravitation, and chemical affinities, possess no capacity for thought, but instead conform to immutable laws. From the outset, a distinction must be drawn between the movement of thought, directed by consciousness and will, and the movement of cosmic energy, governed by mathematical sequence. This duality is reflected in the symbolic pillars of Jachin and Boaz within Freemasonry, which represent law and free will, thereby demonstrating that human progress necessitates a harmonious balance between these twin principles. Law and personality constitute the two primary forces that we are challenged to reconcile. Commencing our inquiry with established facts within the physical realm illustrates the operation of law under known conditions, thereby enabling us to deduce its behavior under as yet unexplored circumstances. We are fortunate that law is immutable and consistent, its apparent diversity arising solely from the infinite variety of conditions under which it operates. We ought first to comprehend its functioning in the ordinary course of nature, for which a few examples will suffice. Scarcely more than a generation ago, it was posited that the analysis of matter could not proceed beyond its reduction to some 70 primary chemical elements, which, through diverse combinations, generated all material substances. Yet, there existed no explanation as to how these various elements originally came into being. Each appeared to be an independent, primary creation, and their origins remained entirely unaccounted for. In contemporary times, however, to invoke the rustic physician in Molière's comedy The Doctor in Spite of Himself, we have altered all that. Modern science has conclusively demonstrated that every species of chemical atom is composed of corpuscles of a single primordial substance that appears to pervade all space, to which the appellation of ether has been assigned. Certain of these particles bear a positive electrical charge, whilst others carry a negative one. The chemical atom is constituted by the grouping of a specific number of negatively charged particles around a nucleus of positive electricity about which they revolve. It is the precise number of these particles and the velocity of their orbit that determine the specific nature of the atom, determining, for example, whether it shall manifest as an atom of iron or of hydrogen. And thus we are returned to Plato's ancient aphorism that the universe consists of number and motion. The dimensions of these etheric particles are so infinitesimally minute as to elude all but abstract mathematical comprehension. Sir Oliver Lodge is reported to have drawn the following comparison during a lecture delivered in Birmingham. The chemical atom, he observed, is as minute in comparison to a single drop of water as a cricket ball is to the terrestrial globe, and yet this same atom is as vast in comparison to one of its constituent corpuscles as the Birmingham Town Hall is to the head of a pin. Furthermore, it has been asserted that, in proportion to the magnitude of these particles, the distance at which they revolve about the atomic nucleus is relatively as vast as the distance separating the Earth from the Sun. I must leave the comprehension of such infinite minuteness to the reader's own imagination, for it transcends my own. Modern science thus reveals all material substance, whether that of inanimate matter or of our own physical bodies, as originating from a single primordial etheric substance that occupies all space and is entirely homogeneous, possessing a uniform constitution devoid of any distinguishing qualities that might differentiate one portion from another. This scientific conclusion is of profound significance, for it demonstrates that from this very homogeneous substance arise particles which diverge from their source by possessing positive and negative energies, and of these particles the atom is subsequently constructed. Consequently, the question arises: what initiated this differentiation? The electronic theory to which I have just alluded conducts us to the concept of a universal, homogeneous ether as the source from which all matter is evolved. Yet it fails to account for the origin of motion therein. Perhaps, however, an intimately related scientific hypothesis may offer assistance. Let us, therefore, direct our attention to the phenomenon of vibrations or waves within the ether. In scientific parlance, the wavelength is defined as the distance from the crest of one wave to that of the wave immediately succeeding it. Modern science recognizes an extensive spectrum of etheric waves, commencing with the most minute currently known, measuring 0.1 micron, or approximately 1/254,000th of an inch in length, as measured by Professor Schumann in 1893, and extending to waves of many miles in length utilized in wireless telegraphy. For instance, those employed between Clifton in Galway and Glace Bay in Nova Scotia are estimated to possess a length of nearly 4 miles. These infinitesimally small ultraviolet or actinic waves, as they are designated, constitute the principal agents in photography, While the immense waves of wireless telegraphy are capable of transmitting a force across the Atlantic of sufficient magnitude to perceptibly affect receiving apparatus on the opposite shore. Hence, we perceive that the ether of space provides a medium through which energy may be transmitted by means of vibrations. But what initiates these vibrations? Hertz announced his discovery of electromagnetic waves, now bearing his name, in 1888. Subsequently, building upon the labors of various other investigators, Lodge, Marconi, and their contemporaries ultimately developed their practical application after Hertz's demise in 1894. To Hertz, however, belongs the distinction of having discovered how to generate these waves by means of abrupt, sharply defined electrical discharges. This principle may be illustrated by the dropping of a stone into tranquil water. The sudden impact generates a series of concentric ripples propagating outward from the center of disturbance, and the electrical impulse acts in a similar manner within the ether. Indeed, the circumstance that these waves propagate omnidirectionally from the central impulse constitutes one of the primary difficulties of wireless telegraphy, as the message may be intercepted in any direction by a receiver tuned to the identical rate of vibration. The interest for us lies in the hypothesis that thought waves function in an analogous manner. That vibrations are excited by sound is exquisitely demonstrated by the eidophone, an instrument invented, I believe, by Mrs. Watts-Hughes, and with which I have observed that lady experiment. Dry sand is dispersed upon a diaphragm, upon which the eidophone concentrates the vibrations emanating from music performed in its vicinity. The sand, as it were, dances in synchrony with the music, and when the melody ceases, it is observed to settle into distinct configurations, resembling at times a tree, a flower, or some geometric figure, but never a disordered array. Perhaps within this phenomenon we may discern the origin of the legends concerning the creative efficacy of the lyre of Orpheus, as well as the sacred dances of antiquity. Who knows? Perhaps a critical reader might object that sound propagates by means of atmospheric rather than etheric waves. Yet, is he prepared to assert that it is incapable of generating etheric waves as well? The recent advent of transatlantic telephony indicates that etheric waves can indeed be generated by sound. For on the 10th of October, 1915, words spoken in New York were instantaneously heard in Paris. Consequently, they could only have been transmitted through the ether, as sound propagates through the atmosphere at a velocity of merely 750 miles per hour, whereas the speed of impulses through the ether is comparable only to that of light, namely 186,000 miles per second. It is therefore a reasonable inference that etheric vibrations may be initiated by sound. The reader may perhaps feel inclined to remark, after the manner of the Irishman, that all this is singularly dry and uninteresting, yet he shall perceive before long that it bears a significant relation to ourselves. For the present, my objective is to demonstrate, through a few illustrative examples, the mathematical precision of universal law. The value of these instances resides in their illustration of the principle that the law may invariably be relied upon to guide us toward advanced knowledge. Observing its operation under established conditions, and relying upon its immutability, we may logically deduce its behavior under alternative hypothetical conditions. In this manner, numerous significant discoveries have been realized. For instance, it was by this method that Mendeleev, the Russian chemist, postulated the existence of three hitherto unknown chemical elements, currently designated as scandium, gallium, and germanium. There existed a lacuna in the systematic sequence of the chemical elements, and relying upon the ancient maxim, nature does nothing by a leap, and that she nowhere leaves a void to be bridged, He reasoned that if such elements did not exist, they ought to do so. He therefore calculated the properties these elements should possess, estimating their atomic weight, chemical affinities, and the like. When they were discovered many years later, they were found to correspond precisely to his description. He prophesied not by conjecture, but through his comprehension of the law. In a remarkably similar manner, radium was discovered by Professor and Madame Curie. In like manner, Hertz was led to the discovery of electromagnetic waves. The celebrated mathematician Clerk Maxwell had calculated all the particulars of these waves 25 years before Hertz, utilizing those very calculations, accomplished his discovery. Furthermore, Neptune, the outermost known planet of our solar system, was discovered by the astronomer Gall as a direct consequence of calculations performed by Leverrier. Certain perturbations in the movements of the planets remained mathematically inexplicable, save upon the hypothesis that a more remote planet existed. Astronomers maintained faith in mathematics, and the hypothetical planet was subsequently proved to be a reality. Such instances might easily be multiplied, but as the French say, of what avail is it? I trust these examples will suffice to convince the reader that the invariable sequence of law is a factor upon which we may confidently rely, and that by studying its operation under known conditions, we may obtain at least some measure of enlightenment regarding conditions that remain as yet unknown to us. Let us now direct our attention to the human subject, and consider a few examples of what is commonly designated as the psychic aspect of our nature. Walt Whitman was entirely correct in asserting that we are not wholly contained between our hat and our boots. We shall find that our modes of consciousness and capacities for action are by no means confined solely to our physical frame. The significance of this line of inquiry lies in the circumstance that, if we indeed possess extraphysical faculties, these also constitute an integral part of our personality and must be included in our estimation of our relationship with our environment. It is therefore highly worthy of our consideration to examine them. Several highly intriguing experiments conducted by de Roches, an eminent French scientist, tend to demonstrate that, under specific magnetic conditions, the sensation of physical touch can be experienced at a remove from the physical body. He observed that under these conditions, the subject of the experiment is insensible to the puncture of a needle inserted into his skin. Yet, if the puncture is made approximately 1.5 inches from the cutaneous surface, he perceives it. Furthermore, at a distance of approximately 3 inches from this latter point, he again perceives the puncture of the needle, whilst remaining insensible to it within the intervening space. Subsequently, there occurs another interval in which no sensation is transmitted, but at a distance of approximately 3 inches further still, he once more experiences the sensation. This pattern continues so that he appears to be enveloped by successive concentric zones of sensitivity, the first situated roughly 1.5 inches from the body, and the subsequent ones occurring at intervals of approximately 3 inches. The number of these zones appears to vary among different subjects, yet in certain instances as many as 6 or 7 have been observed, thereby yielding a radius of sensation extending more than 20 inches beyond the periphery of the physical frame. To elucidate this phenomenon, we must recur to our prior discussion concerning wave propagation. The heart and the lungs constitute the two primary centers of automatic, rhythmic motion within the body, and each projects its respective series of vibrations into the surrounding etheric envelope. The vibrations projected by the lungs are estimated to be 3 times the length of those emitted by the heart, whereas those projected by the heart possess a frequency 3 times as rapid as those of the lungs. Consequently, if both series of waves commence simultaneously, the crest of every third wave of the rapid, shorter series will coincide with the crest of one of the longer waves of the slower series, whereas the intermediate short waves will coincide with the trough of one of the long waves. Now, the effect of the crest of one wave overtaking that of another traveling in the same direction is to elevate the two conjointly at that juncture into a single wave of greater amplitude or height than either possessed individually. Should the reader have the opportunity to observe the incoming waves upon a seashore, he may verify this phenomenon for himself. Consequently, when the more rapid etheric waves overtake the slower ones, they amalgamate to form a wave of greater magnitude, and it is precisely at these junctures that the zones of sensation manifest. If the reader were to delineate a diagram of two undulating lines traversing the same horizontal axis, so proportioned that the crest of each larger wave coincides with the crest of every third wave of the smaller series, my meaning will become apparent. And if he then recalls that the depression of the larger waves neutralizes the elevation of the smaller ones, and that, owing to this dual series originating within the interior of the organism, the surface of the body coincides precisely with one of these neutralized points, he will comprehend why sensation is absent at the cutaneous surface, and he will likewise perceive why the subsequent zones of sensation are situated at twice the distance from one another as the initial zone is from the surface of the body. It is quite simply because the physical boundary of the body bisects the first long wave precisely at its midpoint, and therefore only one half of that wave manifests externally. Such is the explanation advanced by Desroches, and it affords a further illustration of that principle of mathematical sequence to which I have previously referred. It would appear that, under normal conditions, this dual series of vibrations is diffused throughout the entire body, rendering all parts equally sensitive to touch. We may therefore assume, upon the basis of Desroches' experiments and similar investigations, that etheric vibrations do indeed emanate from the human personality. And in the subsequent chapter, I shall present several examples demonstrating that the psychic personality extends far beyond what these experiments, considered in isolation, would indicate. Indeed, we possess an auxiliary range of faculties far transcending those we ordinarily exercise through the medium of the physical body, which must consequently be incorporated into our self-conception if we are to form an adequate comprehension of our true nature. Chapter 2. Some Psychic Experiences. The preceding chapter introduced the reader to the general subject of etheric vibration as one of the primary forces of the universe, serving both as the foundation of all matter and as the medium for the transmission of energy across immense distances, whilst also continually emanating from human beings. In the present chapter, I shall examine this phenomenon more particularly in its latter aspect, which, as an intrinsic element of our own personality, concerns us most directly. I shall begin with an instance of the practical application of this principle. Some years ago, I was taking luncheon at the residence of Lady, in the company of a prominent mental healer whom I shall designate Mr. Y, and a distinguished London physician whom I shall call Dr. W. Mr. Y recounted the case of a lady whose leg had been amputated above the knee several years prior to her coming under his care, who nevertheless frequently experienced pain in the knee and lower portion of the left leg and foot. Dr. W. observed that this was attributable to the nerves which convey the sensations of the extremities to the brain, much as a telegraph line might be tapped at an intermediate point, and Mr. Y agreed that this explanation was entirely correct from a purely physiological standpoint. He further related, however, that upon inadvertently placing his hand where the amputated foot should have been, he perceived its presence. It then occurred to him that, since there was no material foot to be touched, the sensation of contact must have been conveyed to him through the medium of his own psychic body. Accordingly, he requested the lady to imagine herself executing various movements with the amputated limb, all of which he perceived, enabling him to describe each movement to her, a description she confirmed as entirely accurate. To extend the experiment further, he reversed the process. Utilizing his hand, he manipulated the invisible leg and foot in various directions, all of which the lady felt and described. He thereupon resolved to treat the invisible limb as though it were a physical reality, and completed the circuit by taking her left foot in his right hand and her right foot in his left, with the result that she experienced immediate relief and, after successive treatments of this nature, was completely cured. A well-authenticated case of this nature raises numerous intriguing questions regarding the psychic body. However, the most significant point, in my estimation, is that we are capable of experiencing sensation through its agency. In this instance, however, as well as in those cited in the preceding chapter, the physical body was actually present, and were we to restrict our inquiry to this point, we might question whether its presence were not an indispensable condition for the operation of the etheric vibrations. I shall therefore proceed to a class of examples demonstrating that highly singular phenomena can occur without the physical body being present at the location. Numerous well-verified cases of this description are to be found in the archives of the Society for Psychical Research and in other volumes by reliable authors. Nevertheless, it may perhaps interest the reader to learn of one or two instances from my personal experience which, though they may not be as remarkable as some of those recorded elsewhere, tend toward the same conclusion. My initial introduction to Scotland occurred when I delivered the series of lectures in Edinburgh that subsequently led to the publication of my first book, the Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science. In the succeeding year, I delivered a second course of lectures in Edinburgh, but the friends who had so hospitably entertained me on the previous occasion had, in the interim, relocated elsewhere. Nevertheless, a certain Mr. S., whose acquaintance I had formed during my prior visit, invited me to reside with him for a day or two whilst I sought alternative accommodation, though, as events transpired, I remained at his residence for the entirety of the month I spent in Edinburgh. I had, however, never seen his house, which was situated on the side of the city opposite to that where I had previously resided. I arrived there on a Tuesday, and Mr. S. and his family immediately greeted me with the inquiry, "What were you thinking of at 10 o'clock on Sunday evening?" I could not immediately recall my thoughts at that hour, and was, moreover, eager to learn the reason for their inquiry. "We have something extraordinary to relate to you," they replied, "but first, endeavor to recall your thoughts at 10 o'clock on Sunday evening. Were you thinking of us?" I then recollected that, at approximately that hour, I was offering my customary prayers before retiring, and had petitioned that, should my stay with Mr. S. be limited to a mere day or two, I might be directed to a suitable lodging for the remainder of my visit. "That explains it," they replied, and proceeded to inform me that, at the very hour in question, Mr. S. and his son, a young man of about 20, had entered their dining room together and beheld me standing, leaning against the mantelpiece. Both were practical, hard-headed Scotsmen engaged in commerce in Edinburgh, and by no means prone to fanciful imaginings. Nor is it probable that the identical illusion should have presented itself to them both. Consequently, I can only conclude that they indeed witnessed what they reported. At the moment of this appearance in Edinburgh, I was myself in London, entirely unconscious of my psychic visitation. Nevertheless, the fact of my being seen in Edinburgh at the precise moment when my thoughts in prayer were centered upon the residence of Mr. S. is a coincidence suggesting that, in some manner, my thought had projected itself visibly there in the likeness of my physical form. In this instance, as I have observed, I was unconscious of my psychic journey to Edinburgh. I shall now, however, relate a converse experience which occurred in connection with my inaugural visit to that city. At that period, I had never visited Scotland, and, so far as I was aware, was unlikely ever to do so. I was fully awake, engaged in writing in my study at Norwood, where I then resided, when I suddenly found myself transported to a location entirely unknown to me, where stood the ruins of an ancient abbey, a portion of which, however, remained roofed and was utilized as a place of worship. I felt deeply intrigued, and, among other details, observed a Latin inscription upon a tablet set into one of the walls. An invisible guide seemed to conduct me through the precincts, subsequently pointing to a long, low dwelling opposite the abbey and remarking, "This is the residence of the abbey's clergyman." I was then conducted inside the house and shown several rooms of antique appearance. Thereupon, I returned to my normal consciousness, finding myself seated at my writing table in Norwood. I retained, nonetheless, a vivid recollection of the scene I had beheld, though I had no conception of its location, nor indeed any certainty that such a place actually existed. I also recalled a fragment of the Latin inscription, which I immediately recorded in a notebook, my curiosity having been thoroughly aroused. As I have remarked, I had no reason at that time to suppose I should ever journey to Scotland. Yet, several weeks later, I received an invitation to deliver a series of lectures in Edinburgh. Among the guests at the house where I was then residing there was the wife of the County Court Judge of Cumberland. I presented to her, as well as to our hostess, the portion of the Latin inscription I had preserved, suggesting that it might perhaps be discovered somewhere within Edinburgh. Nevertheless, as nothing corresponding to my description could be found, we relegated the entire matter to the realm of inexplicable fancies and dismissed it from our thoughts. The judge's wife departed before me, graciously extending an invitation for me to spend a few days at their residence near Carlisle during my return journey, an invitation I gladly accepted. One day, she drove me to visit Lanercost Abbey, a renowned landmark of the neighborhood. Whilst perambulating the structure, I discovered the very Latin inscription in question embedded in one of the walls. I summoned Mistress, who was standing a short distance away, and said, "Look at this inscription." She immediately replied, "Why? That is the very inscription over which we were all puzzling in Edinburgh." It proved to be an inscription dedicated to the memory of the founder of the abbey, dating from approximately the 12th century. The entire locality corresponded precisely to what I had envisioned, and the long, low parsonage was likewise present there. "I should have wished you to view its interior," Mistress remarked, "but I have never met the vicar, though I am acquainted with his mother-in-law. Therefore, we must abandon the idea." We were on the point of entering our carriage when the garden gate opened, and none other than the mother-in-law emerged. "Oh, mistress," she said, addressing the judge's wife, "I am here on a visit, and you must come in and take tea." Accordingly, we entered and were escorted through the house, in a manner remarkably similar to my vision. Certain portions of the residence were of such antiquity that, among other chambers, we were shown the one occupied by King Edward I during his campaign against Scotland in the year 1296, the historic occasion when the Scottish regalia was captured, and the celebrated crowning stone was brought to England and placed in Westminster Abbey, where it has since remained. This stone possesses an occult relation to the history of both the British and American peoples, a subject of profound interest to both. However, as an extensive literature already exists on this matter, I shall not expatiate upon it here. I shall now relate another singular experience. We had only recently established our residence at Norwood when, While seated one day in the dining room, I suddenly found myself in the hall, where I observed two ladies ascending the staircase. They passed in close proximity to me and, rounding the landing at the summit of the stairs, disappeared from view in an entirely natural manner. They appeared as corporeal as any living person I have ever beheld. One was a stout lady of a somewhat florid complexion, seemingly between 45 and 50 years of age, attired in a silk blouse with delicate purple and white stripes. Leaning upon her arm was a slightly built elderly lady with white ringlets, dressed entirely in black and wearing a lace mantilla. I observed their appearance with particular attention. The next instant, I realized that I was in fact sitting in the dining room, and that the ladies I had observed were merely visionary apparitions. I pondered the significance of this occurrence, but as we had only recently leased the house, I deemed it prudent not to mention it to any member of my family, lest it should cause them alarm. However, a few days later, I disclosed the incident to a certain Mistress F., who I knew possessed some experience in such matters, and she remarked, "You have seen either someone who has previously resided in this house, or someone who is destined to live here." Thereupon, the matter was allowed to rest. Approximately a month later, my wife arranged through correspondence for a certain Miss B to engage as a governess for our children. Upon her arrival, there was no mistaking her identity. She was indeed the stout lady I had previously beheld, and the following morning she descended to breakfast attired in the identical blouse with purple and white stripes. While her identity was unmistakable, I remained perplexed as to the identity of the other figure who had accompanied her. I resolved, however, to remain silent on the subject until we had become better acquainted, lest she should apprehend that my intellect was somewhat deranged. I therefore held my peace for 6 months, at the end of which period I concluded that our mutual acquaintance was sufficient to warrant a belief in each other's sobriety of mind. I then reflected that if I were to relate what I had seen, she might perhaps be influenced by suggestion and imagine a resemblance between the unknown figure and some acquaintance of her own. Thus, I resolved not to initiate the conversation by describing the vision, but rather to inquire first if she knew anyone corresponding to the description, and subsequently disclose the reason for my query. Seizing a suitable opportunity, I inquired whether she was acquainted with any such person, describing the figure to her with the utmost precision. Her expression of surprise intensified as I proceeded, and when I concluded, she exclaimed in astonishment, "Why, Mr. Troward, where could you possibly have seen my mother? She is an invalid, and I am certain you have never met her, yet you have described her with extraordinary accuracy." I then recounted to her the vision I had beheld. She inquired what explanation I could offer for this appearance, to which I could only suggest that, whilst she was seeking employment, she had perhaps paid us a preliminary psychic visit to ascertain whether our household would suit her, and that her mother, being naturally solicitous of her welfare, had accompanied her. The reader may perhaps inquire, what was the outcome of this? Indeed, nothing further ensued, nor did any practical consequence arise from my psychic visitations to Edinburgh and Lanercost Abbey. Such occurrences appear to be simple phenomena of nature which, although occasionally associated with premonitions of varying significance, are by no means invariably so. They represent the operation of certain faculties inherent in us all, of the true nature of which we still remain largely ignorant. It will be observed that in the first of these 3 instances, I was myself the individual perceived, although entirely unconscious of the occurrence. In the final instance, I was the percipient, yet the persons I observed were unaware of their visitation. while in the second case I was conscious of my presence at a locality of which I had never previously heard, and which I physically visited only at a later date. Yet all three cases share this common feature. The psychic visitation was not the result of any conscious act of volition, and furthermore, the psychic projection occurred at a great distance from the physical body. From these personal occurrences, as well as from numerous well-authenticated cases recorded by other authors, I am inclined to infer that psychic activity is entirely independent of the physical organism. In support of this hypothesis, I shall cite yet another experience. It was approximately in the year 1875, during my tenure as a young assistant commissioner in the Punjab, that I was posted to the small, remote station of Akalpur, where I took possession of the assistant commissioner's bungalow. On the night of our arrival at the bungalow, my wife and I had our charpoys, light Indian bedsteads, placed side by side in a certain chamber and retired for the night. My final recollection before falling asleep was that of my wife sitting upright in bed, reading by the light of a lamp placed upon a small adjacent table. Suddenly, I was awakened by the report of a shot and, starting up, found the chamber plunged into darkness. I immediately lit a candle that stood upon a chair by my bedside, and found my wife still sitting upright with her book upon her knee, although the lamp had gone out. "Remove me from here. Take me into another room," she exclaimed. "Why, what is the matter?" I inquired. "Did you not see it?" She replied. "See what?" I asked. "Do not tarry to ask questions," she answered. "Remove me from this room immediately, for I cannot remain here another moment." Perceiving that she was deeply terrified, I summoned the servants and instructed them to remove our beds to a chamber on the opposite side of the house, whereupon she recounted what she had witnessed. She said, "I was reading, as you observed me, when, upon looking round, I perceived the figure of an English gentleman standing in close proximity to my bedside, a man of distinguished appearance with a prominent fair mustache, attired in a gray suit. I was so utterly astonished that I found myself unable to speak, and we remained gazing at one another for approximately a minute. He then bent over me and whispered, 'Do not be afraid,' whereupon there ensued the sound of a gunshot, and everything was plunged into darkness. 'My dear girl, you must have fallen asleep over your volume and been dreaming,' I remarked. 'No, I was entirely awake,' she insisted. 'You were asleep, but I was awake throughout. But you heard the report, did you not?' 'Yes,' I replied. 'That is precisely what aroused me. Someone must have discharged a firearm outside. But for what reason would anyone be shooting in our garden at nearly midnight?' My wife objected. It certainly appeared singular, yet it was the sole explanation that presented itself. Consequently, we were obliged to agree to differ, she being fully persuaded that she had beheld an apparition and that the shot had been fired within the chamber, whilst I was equally convinced that she had been dreaming and that the report had occurred outside the house. The following morning, the proprietor of the bungalow, an elderly widow, Mistress La Chowire, called to make kindly inquiries as to whether she could be of any service to us upon our arrival. After expressing our gratitude, my wife remarked, "I expect you will find it amusing, but I cannot refrain from informing you that there is something peculiar regarding this bungalow." And she thereupon proceeded to relate what she had witnessed. Rather than expressing amusement, the elderly lady assumed an increasingly grave expression as the narrative progressed, and upon its conclusion, she requested to be shown the precise location where the apparition had manifested. My wife conducted her to the spot, and upon being shown it, the elderly Mistress La Chowire exclaimed, This is the most extraordinary occurrence of which I have ever heard. 18 years ago, my own bed occupied the very position where yours stood last night, and I lay there too ill to move when my husband, whom you have described with perfect accuracy, stood precisely where you beheld him and shot himself dead. This declaration by the widow convinced me that my wife had indeed witnessed what she claimed, rather than having merely dreamed it, and this experience has prompted me to conduct further investigations into the nature of occurrences of this character, with the result that, after diligently eliminating all cases which could be explained by other means, I have found myself compelled to acknowledge a significant number of instances of what are termed apparitions, upon the testimony of individuals, whose veracity and soundness of judgment I should not question on any other subject. It is frequently asserted that one never encounters anyone who has personally beheld an apparition, but only those who have heard of others doing so. This assertion I can entirely refute, for I have met numerous trustworthy individuals of both sexes who have provided me with accounts of such manifestations having been personally witnessed by them. In conclusion, I may mention that I was recounting this narrative some 20 years later to a Colonel Fox, who had been acquainted with the unfortunate gentleman who committed suicide, and he inquired of me, "Are you aware of the final words he addressed to his wife?" "I am not," I replied. "They were the self-same words he spoke to your wife," Colonel Fox remarked. This is the narrative to which I refer in my volume Bible Mystery and Bible Meaning, as that of the ghost which I did not see. I do not attempt to offer any explanation for it, but merely present the facts as they transpired, leaving the reader to formulate his own theory on the matter. However, the reason I introduce this narrative in the present context is that, in this instance, there could be no question of the physical body contributing to the psychic phenomenon, since the individual observed had been deceased for nearly 2 decades. Combining this circumstance with the distance from the physical body at which psychic activity occurred in the other cases I have mentioned, I believe there is a very strong presumption that psychic faculties can, and indeed do, operate independently of the physical body, though of course it does not necessarily follow from this that they cannot also operate in conjunction with it. On the other hand, a comparison of the present case with those previously cited fails to elucidate the crucial question of whether the deceased retains any consciousness of the action perceived by the observer, or whether that which is seen resembles a species of photographic impression upon the atmosphere of a particular locality, visible only to certain individuals who possess the capacity to perceive etheric wavelengths lying beyond the range of the single octave that constitutes the solar spectrum. It sheds no light on this question because, in the case of my being seen by Mr. S. in Edinburgh, and that of Miss B. and her mother being observed by me at Norwood, none of us were conscious of having been present in those localities. Whereas, in the case of my psychic visit to Lanercost Abbey and other similar experiences I have undergone, I was fully conscious of perceiving the places in question. The evidence supports both hypotheses, and I can therefore only infer that there exist 2 modes of psychic action. One in which the individual projecting that action, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, experiences corresponding sensations, and another in which he does not. However, I am unable to propose any criterion by which an observer may, with certainty, distinguish between the 2. It appears to me that such instances as those I have adduced point to spheres of etheric action beyond those ordinarily recognized by physical science. Yet the underlying principle seems identical, and it is for this reason that I have taken the modern scientific theory of etheric vibration as our departure point. The universe constitutes a single, magnificent whole, and the laws governing one part cannot contradict those of another. Therefore, the explanation for such extraordinary occurrences is not to be found by denying the well-established laws of nature on the physical plane, but by considering whether these laws do not extend further. It is on this account that I would emphasize the mathematical aspect of things, having adduced instances where various discoveries have been made by pursuing the sequence indicated by already known laws, which have thereby enabled us to bridge lacunae in our knowledge that would otherwise arrest, or at least seriously impede, our further progress. It is in this manner that Jachin assists Boaz, and that the undeviating nature of law, far from circumscribing us, becomes our faithful ally, if we will but permit it to be so. I believe, therefore, that the scientific concept of the ether as a universal medium pervading all space and permeating all substance will assist us in recognizing that many phenomena popularly termed supernatural are to be attributed to the operation of known laws acting under, as yet, unknown conditions. Consequently, when we are confronted with strange phenomena, a knowledge of the general principles involved will indicate the direction in which we should seek an explanation. Now, applying this to the present subject, we may reasonably argue that, since all physical matter is scientifically demonstrated to consist of the universal ether in various degrees of condensation, there may exist other degrees of condensation, forming alternative states of matter that lie beyond the range of physical vision and our laboratory apparatus. Similarly, we may argue that, just as diverse effects can be produced on the physical plane by the action of etheric waves of various lengths, so other effects might be produced upon these subtler states of matter by etheric waves of different lengths. In this connection, we must not overlook the fact that a gap occurs between the dark heat groups and the Hertzian group, consisting of 5 octaves of waves, the lengths of which have been theoretically calculated, but whose operation has not yet been discovered. In this domain, we admittedly possess an extensive field for the operation of established laws under hitherto unestablished conditions. And furthermore, how can we assert that there do not exist ranges of undiscovered waves, either more minute than the ultraviolet ones that initiate the currently recognized spectrum, or transcending those of maximum amplitude that transmit our communications across the Atlantic? Mathematically, no limit restricts this scale in either direction. Thus, anchoring ourselves upon the demonstrated truths of science, we perceive that the known laws of nature indicate their own continuation into modes of matter and force of which we currently possess no conception. Consequently, it is by no means necessary to reject the foundation of established science in order to give flight to our imagination. Rather, it provides the indispensable base from which we may ascend, precisely as the aeronaut cannot rise without a solid surface from which to launch. If we recognize that the ether is an infinitely subtle fluid pervading all space, it becomes apparent that it must constitute a connecting link between all modes of substance, whether visible or invisible across all worlds, and may thus be designated the universal medium. Pursuing our concept of the continuity of law, we may postulate that wave trains, inconceivably smaller or larger than any known to contemporary science, are generated within this medium in a manner analogous to the electromagnetic waves with which we are familiar, namely, by an impulse that originates them from a specific point. Within the realm of subtler forces that we are now exploring, this impulse may well be the desire or will of the spiritual entity that we ourselves constitute, that thinking, feeling, inmost essence of our being which is the noumenon of our individuality, and which, for the sake of brevity, we term our ego, a Latin word signifying I myself. This concept of spiritual impulse is thoroughly familiar to us in our daily discourse. We speak of an impulsive individual, denoting one who acts upon a sudden thought without due regard for consequences. Thus, in common parlance, we regard thought as the primary impulse, though we restrict this characterization to the case of undisciplined thought. Yet, if undisciplined thought serves as a center of impulse, why should disciplined thought not do the same? We may therefore accept the premise of thought as the initial impulse that initiates wave trains within the universal medium, whether conceived with or without deliberate consideration. Having thus acknowledged its dynamic power, we must learn to render the impulses we project intelligent, precisely defined, and directed towards some constructive purpose. The operator at a wireless station does not employ his instruments to project a chaotic array of waves into the ether, but rather regulates these impulses into a definite and intelligible order. We must emulate this practice. Along such lines of reasoning, we may conceive the desire of the ego as initiating a wave train in the universal medium, which is reproduced in a corresponding form upon reaching its destination. As with electromagnetic waves, these may propagate in all directions, much like ripples generated by casting a stone into a pond, yet they will only manifest where there exists a corresponding receptor capable of receiving them. This phenomenon is what electrical engineers term syntony, which denotes being tuned to the same rate of vibration, and it is undoubtedly owing to some such cause that we occasionally experience seemingly inexplicable sensations of attraction or repulsion toward various individuals. This also appears to provide a key to thought transference, hypnotism, and allied phenomena. Should the reader question whether thought is capable of generating impulses within the etheric medium, I would refer him to the experiment detailed in Chapter 14 of my Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science, wherein I describe how, when experimenting with Dr. Baraduc's biometer, I observed the needle revolve through a smaller or larger arc of the circle in response to my mental intention of concentrating a lesser or greater degree of force upon it. It may perhaps be objected that the variation in the movement of the needle depended upon the quantity of magnetism emanating from my person, to say nothing of other recognized forces such as heat, light, or electricity. Indeed, that is precisely the proposition I am advancing. The cause of the variation in the intensity of the magnetic flow was my intention to alter it, so that we return ultimately to mental action as the center of impulsion from which the etheric waves were generated. If, then, such a demonstration can be achieved on the plane of purely physical matter, why should we doubt that the same law operates in an identical manner with respect to those subtler modes of substance and wider ranges of etheric vibrations to which, starting from the foundation of recognized physical science, the law of continuity would lead us by orderly sequence, and which the occurrence of what, for lack of a better term, we designate occult phenomena requires for its explanation? Before proceeding to the more practical generalizations to be derived from the suggestions contained in this chapter, I may address an objection occasionally raised by skeptics in this regard. They inquire, how is it that apparitions are invariably observed in the dark? And subsequently answer their own query by asserting that superstitious individuals are apprehensive in the darkness and imagine various illusions. They then dismiss the matter with derision, believing they have resolved the entire subject. Yet it is not so easily dismissed, for not only are there numerous well-attested cases of such manifestations in broad daylight, but there are also scientific facts demonstrating that, if we are correct in explaining these occurrences by etheric action, such action is more readily produced at night than in the presence of sunlight. In the early months of 1902, Marconi conducted experiments aboard the American liner Philadelphia, which revealed the remarkable fact that, while it was possible to transmit signals to a distance of 1,500 miles during the night, they could not be transmitted beyond 700 miles during the day. The same phenomenon was observed by Lieutenant Solari of the Italian Navy, at whose disposal the vessel Carlo Alberta was placed by the King of Italy in 1902 for the purpose of investigating wireless telegraphy. In summarizing the conclusions he considered to have been fully established by his experiments aboard that vessel, He includes the fact that sunlight has the effect of diminishing the power of electromagnetic waves, and that, consequently, a greater force is required to produce a given result by day than by night. Here, then, exists a reason why we might anticipate a greater frequency of super. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.